In. So welcome to our IMBES Ask Me Anything series for 2023. IMBES is the International Mind-Brain Education Society. And the series is presented with the aim of building connections among IMBES trainees and non-trainee practitioners and researchers, and really to support the translation of research into policy and practice. It is also our effort to expand the community and welcome new names and faces to this space. So if this is your first IMBES event, we're really glad that you're here. And if you find this interesting and you want to share it out to people, we really want to use this as an outreach opportunity to grow our community. So who we are, I'm Chris Simmers from the University of Connecticut, a PhD student in the learning sciences, and Sarah Gilmore.
Yes, I am also a PhD student in learning sciences at the University of Connecticut, and I am the policy and practice chair in the IMBES trainee board, and Chris is the co-president of the trainee board for IMBES. Thank you so much for being here. We also have a whole bunch of more people from the board here today, so if you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Sylvia, and I'm also a PhD student in the Cog Neuro world, and and I'm also on the board, co-president with Chris, and we are really, really grateful for you guys to all join us today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Floor. I'm the social media chair of the IMBES trainee board. I'm a PhD student at KU Leuven in Belgium, which will be the venue of next year's IMBES conference. So very excited about that, and hope you all have a great session today.
Hi, I'm Verani Men. I recently graduated from the University of Oregon School Psychology program, and I'm currently a practicing school psychologist in Oregon, and I currently am the secretary on the trainee board.
That's all of us, right? I was waiting, but that's all of us. So just before we start, just a quick kind of housekeeping of what to expect. These sessions are recorded because we share them on our YouTube channel later. Watch out for an announcement about that on Twitter. If you've registered, you'll also get an email with the link to the recording once it's available and any resources that Fumiko wants to share. We have two ASL interpreters here with us today, Amy and Karen. So if you need ASL interpretation, you can turn that on, and those videos will also be part of the video on YouTube. We also have captioning. And if you need any other services that would be helpful for you for participating in the future, please just reach out and let us know. We're happy to set up whatever people need to be able to be part of the community and engage. We're going to start with a 15-minute presentation from Fumiko Hoeft, our speaker today. And then there'll be a 15-minute facilitated discussion led by Chris, where she'll ask some kind of common questions. And then we'll move on to a 15-minute open Q&A session with questions from you. So if things occur to you while Fumiko is talking, you can put them in the chat and I'll start gathering them together into a document, or you can write them down for yourself. And once we get to the AMA, the Q&A part, you can either ask your own question or I'm happy to ask it for you. So with that, I'll let Chris introduce Fumiko.
Yes, and this is a very abridged bio, so hopefully you'll also get a feel for just the vast amount of incredible work that Fumiko does. But Fumiko Hoeft MD and PhD is a professor of psychology and several other departments in education, math, computer science, and medicine at the University of Connecticut and UCSF. She also directs an Educational Neuroscience Lab called brainLENS at UConn UCSF, UConn's Brain Imaging Research Center, and UConn Waterbury. Her research focuses on the neurobiology of dyslexia and learning disabilities, its social-emotional outcomes, factors that promote resilience and compensation, and emotional well-being. Honors include awards from IMBES, Learning in the Brain Foundation, Society for Neuroscience, and the International Dyslexia Association, among others. So, Fumiko, we're very excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm going to share my slides, and then while I tell you a little bit about the background of how I named my lab, If you don't know, UConn is quite famous for, I think, famous for having good acronyms, which I think is quite important. It's not, name is not everything, but it is kind of nice to have a nice, cute name. Our lab is called brainLENS, and it originally stood for Laboratory for Educational Neuroscience. I think some people, and I use it even sometimes. I wanted to change it when I came to UConn, so I kept the acronym, but then changed it to a very complicated one, Learning, Engineering, and Neurosystems. It's interesting. So I named that lab when I went to UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. It's a biomedical institution. It's very heavily medicine oriented. When I started my postdoc with John Gabriele in 2003, long time ago, at Stanford, I was starting to get into educational neuroscience or mind, brain, and education. And when I moved to UCSF, people said it's a school of medicine. And I really wanted to not demystify, but kind of soften the medical sort of environment. And I said, now I can name anything I want to. And that's where I had control. So I wanted to be a contrarian sort of in a medical school and name something after education. So that's how I came up with the name. The other thing is, when I came up with the name, I had only started the lab. I only had one half-time person working with me. This is 11 years ago. And that was the first kind of initiation of this lab. And he came up to me. I said, we're going to use brainLENS. I think it's a good name. And then he said, are you sure you want to use that name? And I said, why? And he said, if you Google for the first time, every time you do it, it comes up and says, did you mean brainless, as though there's no brain? And so I thought it was a cute name because that's all we do, brain imaging stuff. So that's how I kept the name brainLENS. And now at least on my browser, it shows up properly as brainLENS. All right, so I'm going to go through the next 15 minutes. I'll just go through a little bit of my background. I debated on whether I talk more about research, but we'll see how it goes. If it's not interesting, you can wave at me and I'll stop and cut it short, and I can pull up some research slides. I'm very flexible, and I think this is a great size of group, so we can casually talk and stop and start and so on. All right, so a little bit of background about myself. This is my elementary school graduation book I wrote. If you can read in Japanese, even if you can read in Japanese, probably my handwriting is really horrible. Probably I would be diagnosed with dysgraphia. My son is actually. We just say, oh, he just got our poor handwriting. But it was to be a physician and help the underserved, and that's what it says here. And I always wanted to be a physician MD. I went to high school. I was in London at the time. And then after I graduated, because I was so shy, my childhood nickname when I was in elementary school was Fumiko Who Blushes. And so I always wanted to be able to communicate with people, more talk. I was okay with one-on-one, not with big groups. And so I took the job at McDonald's. Plus, they gave me free clothes like this, uniform, and a free McDonald's meal every day. So that was an attraction for me. I didn't quite become a good communicator. This is many years ago after I became a researcher. 4 years ago, I was giving a talk at the Oracle Park at EdRev. It was an expo, and I was giving a talk there. My son came along. I usually used to try to bring my kids along before they would learn how to protest and not come. Actually, my older son loves to come into the talk. The younger one doesn't so much. He came. He had I knew he had risks for dyslexia. All the warnings were I saw all the risk factors. He didn't like writing nor reading, but then he said he wanted a piece of paper and pen, and he said he wanted to take notes. And he said he was going to give me feedback after my talk. And I thought, oh, wow, are you going to give me, do you even know how to give feedbacks when people give talks? And he said he knows these kind of things. So I gave him a paper and pencil. I was very excited that he was willing to write willingly, very rare. And this is what he gave me afterwards. He wrote, you droned too much, you were too quiet. She said, too much, didn't use hand signs, gestures, sounds bored with only a hint of enthusiasm. So let's see if we could do any better today. And then so that was after I became a researcher. But once I graduated from high school, I went to med school. And then first I wanted to help the underserved. I was thinking about going to the developing countries. So I became an ER doc, internal medicine. And then I got fascinated by the brain sort of later in life in a way and became a psychiatrist. I decided to move to the States. Okay, I'll tell you the reason. Well, let me just do this part first. So then I did my pre and postdoc at various institutions, became faculty at various places. During my postdoc, when I was at Stanford, as I said earlier, I met John Gabrielli, who was doing dyslexia and neuroimaging research, and I was fascinated by it, but also I became a dyslexia researcher because I wanted to have more impact. I felt that in medical conditions, it is fairly a population is small that you impact certain people with certain disease, even though you could have major impact and breakthrough. And so I thought dyslexia was a great place because it impacts so many of us, and reading impacts all of us. Also, I was doing research back at Caltech on auditory visual integration, how audition and auditory and visual stimuli integrate. And John Gabrielli convinced me that dyslexia is the ultimate form. Reading is an ultimate form of cross-modal integration. And because I wanted to do more translational work, because of my medical background or clinical background, that's how I got into dyslexia research. And it's been 20 years since I started that research. 5 years ago, I came to UConn to lead the Brain Imaging Research Center. I still do. I was supposed to step down this month, but I have still not been able to get off of it. So I'm still the director there. And then last year, I took on this job to lead one of the UConn campuses called UConn Waterbury. It's a small campus, heavily undergraduate, heavy minority serving institution. And I felt like it was a great way to learn for myself, but also be able to serve. And surprisingly, the research that I do on learning and education is very relevant. Also, writing grants and executing and managing labs has high relevance to administrative work. So I felt like there's a lot of skills that I could transfer. There's a lot of things that I could learn and I can contribute. And so I decided to step into this role. So I run the imaging center, I run labs at UCSF and UConn, and then I administer this campus right now. The reason why I came to the States was I was interested in brain imaging research, but also I wanted to do, and I couldn't do what I wanted to do, which was transcranial magnetic stimulation back in Japan. But also, just to give you a background, since there's a lot of female here, why I came to the States. So this is what I remember from med school in Japan. This is 30 years ago. I can't believe I'm that old. This is written up in the papers 5 years ago. It became a big problem in Japan. So they discovered that they were prioritizing admissions to male. My medical school, we had 1:9 ratio of women to men. And if it went by scores, it would have been 5 to half and half. And so the things that I was told while I was in med school in front of my face from professors were, you just reduce your chance of getting married by coming to this med school. It was a fairly kind of cerebral academic place, and people thought that whoever would go there is smart. And so people thought, if you're smart, no one wants to marry you. If based on merit, male, female would be 50 to 50, as I said, and 10% at my school were female then. It's still underrepresented. And then, so when this news came out, it's funny because, well, it's not really funny for the people who are impacted. They send out acceptance letters to every female who should have been accepted that they could trace back decades later. So probably my peers who couldn't get in were getting acceptance letters 30 years later. I don't know how many accepted and went actually back to med school, but I presume not many. So it's a very kind of a closed environment, and I wanted to go to a place that was less closed, and that's part of the reason why I came to the States. They also told me we don't like accepting women because after training you end up quitting and having kids anyway. Instead of thinking about it more as a systems problem, that it was kind of put the blame on women. So that's sort of my background of how I came to the States, in addition to research reasons. I wanted to point out some mentors and colleagues. I'm not going to go through them, just to point out that there were many mentors who showed me the love for basic research, which I was not interested in. I always wanted to be a physician. I always wanted to impact people directly and do clinical work or practical practice. And also who showed me the love for doing translational dyslexia research. And then there were some people who opened up my eyes beyond research and beyond neurobiological mechanisms to be more interested in looking at the whole child through looking at their educational system, social-emotional aspects, resilience, looking at strengths and not just weaknesses, and so on. And then also taught me how to be compassionate as a researcher, advocate, colleague, mentor, leader, working in policy and so on. And also as a female scientist to pay it forward. Lori Cutting, I'll point out, Elena Grigorenko also, and they helped me a lot going through the process, and also helped me get me at the first subcontract because I was working for free on many people's project back then. This is briefly the kind of research that I do right now in our laboratory. We are proposing new theories, neurobiological theories. One is neuro-noise hypothesis. We also try to look at, so I try to leverage my medical background, my mental health psychiatry background, and try to incorporate that into my dyslexia research. I cannot claim that I know a lot about education or a lot about language and linguistics like many other people do, but I do have that additional extra training in that. So I try to leverage that, and this is why we study the neurobiological mechanisms of dyslexia, propose new theories, look at parent-offspring intergenerational transmission from the neurobiological lens. We also look at big data like you do at this pediatrician's office. We look at developmental trajectories and sort of create growth charts for, instead of height and weight, but for brain networks for dyslexia, reading, ADHD, and so on. We also look at the environment, which is, as we all know, very, very important. One example was we looked at multilingual exposure, being a bilingual myself. I was very interested in this, and it made me feel like I'm almost dyslexic. And a lot of people think I have ADHD and dyslexia, but that is, it got me very interested in thinking about how that impacts one language, impacts another language. I'm also very interested in how people learn to compensate. Is it just the intervention that they were exposed to, or is there something innate in their brain that they're more plastic and prone to going in one direction versus the other? For example, using memory strategies or using semantic strategies to overcome reading, for example. And this is kind of why we're in, I got into some projects. And then being a psychiatrist, I'm always interested in social emotional stuff, but I didn't know how to mesh them together. My first postdoc, who was an education PhD, now a department chair in social work at Boston College, got me into this. But now we are one of the 6 national NIH emotional wellbeing networks around the country. It's not really focused on learning disabilities or learning differences, but we look at kind of the whole spectrum from children, those with disabilities, and so on. And that's our network specialty. I'm also interested in sort of, some people think in medicine think that this is going to go nowhere and it's a dead end, but I'm very interested in stigma and stereotypes and how that impacts their performance. And so we study that. We look at mentoring impacts, so not just medical interventions or dyslexia interventions, but look at more of these other aspects that could help the student or child. And then I love, as some of you know, I love doing translational outreach research, like developing EdTech screeners and studying the COVID slide using EdTech and doing science outreach, including working in policy. Sorry, I'll go quickly. I apologize. So this is almost 10 years ago. Our lab was small. I only had half a person to start with my small startup package that I had 11 years ago. And then it's grown. It's a little bit smaller now, but it's grown since. And we are fortunate to get a number of different kinds of funding. But the one thing I want to point out is we're very excited, and Kristen and Sarah are part of this also. But we received an NSF PhD training grant called Transcend. It's focused on educational neuroscience, diversity, strength-based approach, and combining AI and neuroscience technologies and kind of learning together, and co-creating with various partners is a major component as well. So very excited. We just had our orientation last Thursday. And as some of you know, as I said, I love science outreach. First, it started off from very selfish reasons. I wanted to recruit kids. And in order to recruit kids, I'm very shy, so I don't like selling things. And so if it's a science class that you're selling, it's much easier. We started talking to the PTA and then in public schools, and that's how we got through the back door instead of the front door going through superintendents and individual schools. And they wanted us to come back because we were giving free science classes, and that kind of expanded to field trips on our campus, big AT&T Stadium events, and then during COVID, these virtual kind of science classes that we had class in, and many graduate students, including Kristen, participated, and we all taught together. I like dressing up, and I like Halloween, as you can imagine, as well. All right, and then I formed a bunch of partners with various schools, State Department of Education, and then several years ago in 2017 or 2018, Ken Pugh, a professor at UConn and Yale, we established a Haskins Global Literacy Hub, where a major project, not just international work to help global literacy, but also we started building in-school EEG research grade laboratory, which is led by Nicole Landy here from UConn. The goal was to increase literacy around the world through co-creation of services, training, advocacy, and research. I call it STAR, opportunities within stakeholders. It moved to Yale, it was independent, moved to Yale, and we're trying to get it to be a UConn Yale by institutional initiative with right now. So when I look back, I feel like I've gone from one to another, and I've done psychiatry research or psychiatry clinical work, depression research, TMS, engineering sort of work, developing TMS coils and so on, and then got into dyslexia and mental health, socio-emotional aspects. So what I try to explain to people what I'm interested in, and maybe I'm post hoc justifying, but to take a whole child approach through a neurobiological lens so that children can reach their full potential. And through that, I'd love to have impact on communities, K-12, families, educator policy, and that's part of the reason I'm doing administration now. And if I have one take-home message, I feel like I was trying to think of what would I do? Would I do anything differently? I can't do anything differently because I have too many interests, like probably many of you. But everything will come to full cycle if you focus on one thing at a time and put 100% in. I know many of you were teachers, many of you are school psychologists now or cognitive neuroscientists, do that really well. And then even though the grass next doors look greener, you can do that after you perfect what you're doing right now. And then if you live long enough as I do, it'll come to full cycle, and you get to use all of those skills. That's it. I have a 3-minute video, but I don't have to do that. I know I talked too much. Would you like to look at a 3-minute video? All right.
Yeah,
so,
we have time. That's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to show you a 3-minute video. This is when we were developing a screener app for dyslexia, and we wanted to develop, and I was doing fundraising many years ago. This is 2016. Ultimately, we were funded by some CZI, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Facebook guy, and then also we were funded by the University of California president to create a 6-university initiative. And so I led that for a while before coming to UConn. But to do that, I had I had to do a pitch, and I had to create a video in 2 weeks. And so I had to script it, do a bid, and get videographers, find schools that I could record, and so on. And this is what we came up with as a concept of the kind of screener that we wanted to make at the time. So it's 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes.
One of the biggest challenges we face is the educational achievement gap. So many of our children are struggling with early education. Many of them go undetected.
They often have lower self-esteem, feel socially isolated, and have higher rates of suicide and imprisonment.
We brought together a really diverse group of scientists from UC San Francisco, Berkeley, Stanford, and other universities, focused on this goal of seeing if we could take neuroscience principles, couple them with technological development to really transform education.
We perform everything from R&D to validation in our labs,
And by using neuroscience research, we can now develop apps that are engaging, efficient, and tailored to each child's needs.
Familiar
Through
faces.
evaluation, we can understand not what a child has learned, but how their brains actually go through the learning process itself. And through enhancement, we can then take that information and make it actionable to improve those skills.
One of our most exciting projects is to develop a neuroscience-based app to identify learning disability risk in preschoolers. This app will help teachers, parents, and caregivers understand each child's strengths and weaknesses and empower them with these strategies and recommendations tailored for each child.
This technology is inexpensive, it's accessible, it can have great reach around the world.
With this technology, we can finally close the achievement gap and give every child the chance to succeed.
All right, so I will stop here. And sorry, that was an old one. It was old ancient days when I was associate professor. Seems like such a long time ago. But thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions from Kristen or other people.
Thank you. Well, we've already had some great questions from the audience. So to keep us to time, I'm just going to ask you one, and then we'll go to the participant questions. But looking at the work that you've done, what do you think you would describe as the most impactful change that you've seen, either arising directly from the work that you do or just in the field that you're working on?
So let me see. That's a loaded question. I think I'll just try to kind of list a couple of things, but I think to me, I feel like working with students in our lab and then I want to be a contagious person where I can get other people excited about the science outreach, whether dressing up or whatever it might be, and doing that together. And then graduate students or postdocs or other people who came in thinking they weren't going to do that and that's not their thing, wanting to do that and seeing the importance. I often said we would often look at press articles, and often we would look at our own when it's in the press and say, oh, this is not what we said, or they're completely kind of saying that it has genetic implications when we say nothing about genetics. And then the first answers that you get from students are often, this is why we don't like, or other colleagues is, this is why we don't like talking to the press. Maybe people don't think about it. And certainly this crowd, I don't think thinks that way, but because of your background and training, but I used to get a lot of those. And I said, this is exactly why you want to communicate with them and exactly why we should. And so when I can win them over, I feel like it's a win, and that's been very gratifying. In terms of just the neuroscience research, I think we were the first to sort of bring in and create toolboxes. I used to do a lot of coding, machine learning toolbox. I made the first MBPA toolbox. We made the first graph analysis toolbox, network analysis toolbox. Some people surprisingly still use it. It was like 10 years ago or even longer time ago. But, and so it is, so it's been great to kind of be able to translate some of the tools to make it accessible to other people, and then kind of instill the idea that we can use imaging to be translational. And then people got into this predicting outcome using neuroimaging, machine learning, that kind of took off. Well, I'm not saying I was the first one, but in our education dyslexia sort of field, a lot of people quote it as one of the good early examples in 2011. So I'll just list 2 examples.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we have a few questions already, but if any other questions have to come up, please put them in the chat and we will do our best to curate those and voice them. So we have an interest in hearing more about the neural noise hypothesis.
All right, so the neural noise hypothesis is where we say that some of the risk genes, there's many risk genes for any disorder. For dyslexia, there's a dozen or so and more now, but some of the genes have impact on the glutamatergic system. In the brain, there's the excitatory glutamate and then the inhibitory GABA, and the balance is very important. And some noise, even though we say neural noise hypothesis and it sounds all bad, noise is actually good for you and you need some of that. So if you need noise to maximize signals to noise ratio, and because it accentuates some of the signal by through these noise. But what we're claiming is that some of these risk genes might have excessive impact on the glutamatergic system and excessive impact on noise, increasing it. So the cortical excitability goes up, and then all this craziness goes up in the brain, and then that would make the brain unstable. So especially for things like speech perception, where you may have heard the word entrainment, where if you hear speech, the brain signal tends to entrain and move synchronous with it. That gets messed up because of these noise. And then also things like cross-modal integration, auditory visual integration. These things all require fine temporal resolution. So whenever there's noise, it messes up some of these alignments, and then that could lead to phonological awareness problems, cross-modal integration problems, and lead to reading problems in some individuals. And then one question that we get often is, well, neuronoise hypothesis, you hear some of the increased glutamate in other neurodevelopmental conditions also. Why would it only happen in dyslexia? And I'll give you the answer. The answer is we don't know. But people like asking that question because I think it's a legitimate question. Why is one part of the brain impacted and that impacts only one condition? Because one part of the brain does many things in concert with the network. And so people care about the networks now. People look at more of these synchrony in these things now to kind of try to understand it. But still, if you go back to the egg of the egg of the egg, we still don't know what the egg of the egg of the egg is. But I'll stop here.
Could you just mention what you're doing, what the research is entailing right now? Are you screening tons of kids for this particular genetic makeup, and then you're actually following up with them, or how can you test for that?
We cannot test for it, especially with the current federal funding mechanism. The longest grant you get is 5 years, so you have to have something in 5 years. So we do it in kind of piecemeal. So we take some projects, we look at 5 to 8, and then try to screen behaviorally or family history wise, because we think that especially the phonological system is more impacted through family history and genetics compared to orthographic or other processes. So we look in one grant, we look at 5 to 8 and try to test some of these neuronoise hypotheses. Some we look at adults and then try to look back in history and say, how did they learn to compensate? And we look at snapshots at a very short snapshots at a time. I'm not saying that they should trust us and give us a 20-year grant and to test 20,000 kids, but that would be ultimately necessary.
Right. We have another question related to dyslexia. And just to provide some background to this, I'm doing pilot research at UConn and found that the vast majority of our graduating master's students believe that letter reversal is the primary indicator of dyslexia. So given your experience, what do you think might help teachers to understand dyslexia more? Or what do you think are some core ideas that would be helpful for teachers to understand about dyslexia?
What would be the best way to help understand? I think people like all of you, the more we get it to communicate with teachers and go into the classroom. I know it sounds very simple and things that everyone knows, but I really think that then people learn through osmosis. And I mean, those teachers who believe so learn through osmosis. And so we need to undo it and be the majority winner so that they hear us more. So I think that's one thing. I want to be a contrarian and say one thing about letter reversal, though. I know some senior researchers will attack me for saying this, and I'm glad I'm in a virtual room, but I do think that some things that a lot of people believe is true through grandma's old wisdoms and other things, there's some truth to it, and there's always something to be researched. Often people might say, oh no, that's so incorrect, and it's more of the phonological theory, but I think education and research tend to swing one way or the other, as you probably know from the whole word approach and others and so on. So I think it's, even if you are not a majority, if you believe that there might be some truth to your observations, and that's what clinicians did when they got into medical research. They would do a case study of one, and then they would say, oh, this is very interesting, there might be more to it, and then they would study more and more, and then sometimes it leads to major discoveries. So I don't want to encourage you to go in the wrong direction and spend 10, 20 years, but I do want you to follow your gut and experience and wisdoms and use that also. And that's how we got into the intergenerational transmission. This is how we currently have a depression comorbidity kind of hypothesis for dyslexia and immune system, and trying to follow that also. And of course, sometimes it's hard to get funding that way, but I truly believe, so letter reversal, I'll take letter reversal as an example. I heard enough and I've seen enough that there are people who reverse. If you talk to developmental psychologists, they'll say everyone reverses letters at some point in their development, age 4 or 5, and it's a short period and they move on, and it's not an indicator of dyslexia. Everyone has it. But there are observations, and I don't think a lot of research has been done to my satisfaction, at least, but some people believe that maybe that period is extended. Of course, that's not the cause of it, but it's an indication of something that's more fundamentally going on in the brain. So I think I can't really say it in major conferences because people ask me, where's the evidence? But I do feel like it's worth pursuing. And a lot of the things that people have rejected, if you look at it, there's only a couple papers from the 80s or 70s with very poor research techniques back then. And so and then you go and I talked to, for example, Al Galabruta, if you know, from one of the kind of major theories that were proposed in dyslexia, that a lot of people kind of debunked it and said that that's not true with Geschwin. But when you talk to them, they'll say, oh, we did a study and it wasn't true. And I said, was it really true? And how much did you do research on this, like prenatal impact? And he said, actually, you're right. It wasn't done too much. And then we only looked at this aspect. We should have done this and that. And so that's how we got our NIH grant on intergenerational transmission, trying to look at prenatal, postnatal, and those kind of impacts. So follow your gut instincts that you've seen in clinical work or in the school settings, and do it on the side until someone funds you.
I've got a really quick follow-up to that, just because I think the next question is going to pivot to a different direction. I was just thinking about, when I was teaching, I had a lot of students who were dyslexic, and I never received any training or support in how to help students with dyslexia. And I feel like there's this gap between, the research that happens and what teachers learn about and do. And I'm just wondering, do you do anything where you work with government organizations, policy, in that way that it's not about individual teachers having to find out the information, but something more systematic about trying to get the information into teacher education?
Yes. So I've worked for California and Connecticut's Department of Education's Task Force on Dyslexia. And in California, we created the guideline, but it's only guidelines. And so they're not able to mandate. Even if they are now, they're moving finally into mandating screening. But in Connecticut, it's the same thing also. They have the laws and they are supposed to do screening, and they do screening, but there's guidelines on what they can give, guidelines on which product to use. And it's often, as you know, geared towards those who shout louder or have money, maybe politics. And I've seen some of that where we have this rule and we created this table of what's most scientifically valid in terms of set of tools and things that we should screen for. And then right before it gets approved, someone comes in, and I won't say who, but comes in and talks to the governor or senator, and then they kind of reverse things or soften things or get their screener in. And so, it's a constant battle. You can start from the top, you can start from the bottom, you can talk to, and then also they'll say, this is a guideline, it's ultimately up to the superintendents. Then you can talk to the superintendents, but then they'll say it's ultimately up to the schools. And so it's very challenging. And I think we just have to hit all levels, and all of them are important.
Thank you. We do have a follow-up from Christina. I want to say, oh, my chat window just disappeared. Christina, asking, the neural noise hypothesis reminds me of overlapping characteristics of auditory processing disorder and functional vision issues. Do you test for those conditions in the dyslexia studies?
So I know people say it's not about hearing and it's not about vision, and that's exclusion criteria for dyslexia. So one thing before I get into it, I want to say that it's a really big problem to use those as exclusion criteria, because people who are deaf and others will have dyslexia. People who are bilinguals, which is often used as an exclusion, or they will say that even if you're bilingual, it has to be above and beyond that. It's really hard to say whether it's above and beyond. That's why people have told me for 20 years, and I still make the same mistakes. And people say, oh, you're bilingual, you're fine. If you're in college, you went to graduate school, you're a professor, so you can't be dyslexic. And then people are like, oh, you're still making the same questions since you came to the States, it's 25 years ago. And so I feel like it's about time that people should not cut me slack anymore. But so I think, so there's a kind of a definitional problem. So that's one thing. But basic auditory and hearing vision, we do rule out in general. But I do feel like it's a little bit of a slippery slope, because some people, when they hear auditory processing disorders, is not part of it. But if you look at the measurements and the research findings of dyslexia, like speech and noise processing is impaired in auditory processing disorders. And then people say 50% of those with auditory processing disorders have dyslexia. And then when you look at dyslexia research, a lot of them have these speech and noise and these kind of dichotic listening, these kind of issues. And then you start thinking, well, what is the difference? And maybe there is something causally related biologically between them. So again, like this letter reversal and listen to your grandmother's wisdoms sort of story, I do feel like there's a lot more to be explored. I think part of it has been a historical issue that, for example, education people, and a lot of the phonological processing believers back in the days, and it's still a major risk factor, thought that everything starts from phonological processing and reading, and then there's nothing biological underlying it. But as mind, brain, and education researchers, we all believe that there's a brain basis for every single cognitive and educational component. Of course, there's a large environmental component, but a big biological component and predisposition as well. And so I think we really need to kind of think about it that way. And I think everyone's thinking more this way, like you all are, but I think we're moving in the right step then. Also, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, Fumiko, what do you want to say?
Sorry, just one thing. We're starting a new undergraduate program, and the welcome starts at the hour. I said I would be late, and they were supposed to dance or sing until I got there, but I can't be too late. So I just wanted to let you know, it takes me a couple minutes to walk over. So
no problem at all. We always make sure we stop by 1 at the very latest, because you've got to be somewhere in person. Shall we make sure we stop in 5 minutes?
That would
10
be
to? Is that enough time for you?
Perfect.
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Okay, we've got a couple more here. So Tracy was wondering, Tracy has a couple of questions. She's curious about what kinds of things are mentioned in your preschool screening app, and she's also curious about the Haskins Global Literacy Club.
Okay, great. So the screening, I'll tell you, it's a very political and complicated question. So the latest, I do not know, because we started this and we got UCSF funding and all these funding, and we brought it to UConn, we did some validation, but currently it's funded by the California governor. So it's staying very tight within California, even though I have an appointment there also. It's very tightly staying in there, and it's supposed to be released. I thought it was this fall that they would start doing it in Spanish speaking kids and typical, and we had thousands of data. It is it's the typical suspects, but I don't know the fine details, like phonological memory and receptive, expressive vocabulary, and these kind of things were planned to be in there, but I don't know what made it to the final minimalist, because screenings are not made equal. You could do a 20-minute screener that will only get your reading measurement. You could do an hour screener that will give you more fine details. You could do 6 hours, but that's not possible. So it depends. I think it's an a la carte sort of menus sort of thing. So I apologize, it's not very specific. The other one was
the activities in the Haskins Global Literacy Group.
So there's a website, Haskins Global Literacy Hub. What we did was we leveraged when COVID hit, what we did was we tried to get what we thought was the best ed tech for literacy acquisition, because we thought that would be very in that age range, and those who will eventually struggle and have risk will struggle. So we gave out, we did some fundraising to give out as many licenses as possible, and we give out millions of licenses of what's known as GraphoGame. GraphoLearn, it has its limitations, but we knew the research, so we did that. We also created libraries of resources. It's hopefully up on that website still, and it was created by people like Maureen Lovett from Canada and Marian Wolf, and all these people got together and contributed to creating these resource libraries. And then we have some of these more validation kind of research studies, the in-school EEG labs in the States, but also in Brazil. We're working with the government, or some researchers are working with the government to kind of test literacy acquisition. So we have a number of different projects.
All right, so if we're definitely going to be able to let you go on time, and that's really important, I know there are still more questions. How can people get in touch with you, Fumiko?
I would love to hear from you. I have one favor. If you do write once and don't hear in a couple days or the day of, write to me again, please, and write to me again, or you can do an auto send every week until you hear from me. So that would be great. If you reach out to, I'm sure, Sarah or Kristen also, I'm sure they will make sure that I respond also. So, but I'm happy. And then I have my cell phone on everywhere whenever I sign things, and I give it out to everyone. Sometimes people call me in the middle of the night. They think it's a regular office phone and they want to leave a message, but texting me is always great. And so I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I just kind of wrap us up. Why don't you pop any details in the chat, Fumiko, that you're willing to share with people for contact? And thank you for coming today and talking to us. And thank you also to everybody for making the time to come and be here. It's what makes the AMAs possible and work that you're here. Thank you also to Karen and Amy, our ASL interpreters. We're so grateful that you're here. We will share any materials, links, recommendations that came out of today's session when we share the link to the recording. And our next session is at the moment to be decided. If you have any suggestions for people that you would like to hear from, we're also really interested to make sure we don't just hear from researchers, we also hear from practitioners, we hear from policymakers, we hear from the whole community. Please get in touch with us. You can tweet us. I'll put or maybe Flor, could you please put our handle in the chat for Twitter? Or you can email me. I'll put my email address in the chat too, and let us know if you have a contact or someone you would really like to hear from, because we would love to hear from you. And thank you again, everybody, and we will let you go.
Thank you. Wow, this is amazing. You're letting me go 10 minutes in advance. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Fumiko, you have to have your son watch this, and then he will regrade you. A+.
Yes. Thank you. I will have him write up his notes again and share it if I ever get him to write again.